Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a pretty fascinating and honestly fundamental tension that is completely defining the United Kingdom's public finances right now. On one side of the equation, you've got the government. They have a desperate need to fund rapidly escalating costs, things like massive welfare bills and the interest on the national debt. But on the other side of that same equation, there's a really firm political commitment to keeping headline tax rates exactly where they are. So how do you square that circle? How on earth do you raise billions and billions of pounds without ever actually raising the tax rate? Well, the answer lies in a highly effective, almost totally invisible mechanism.
First, I want you to ask yourself a super relatable question. Why does your pay rise so often feel like a pay cut? You know the feeling, right? You get that promotion or maybe an annual cost of living adjustment, so your nominal wage, the actual number on your paycheck, goes up, but at the end of the month, your purchasing power seems to have somehow shrunk. You look at your bank account and think, wait, where did that extra money actually go? It's an incredibly frustrating reality for millions of workers out there, and the truth is, it is entirely by design.
It all comes down to a concept called fiscal drag, or as it's commonly known, bracket creep. Now, the easiest way to understand this is to think of the tax system as a series of stationary doorways. When your nominal wages rise, which usually happens just to keep pace with inflation, your income effectively grows taller. But here's the catch. The doorways, meaning the tax thresholds, they remain completely static. They don't move up with inflation. So, as your income grows taller, you are quite literally dragged over that stationary threshold and into a higher tax band. It's an incredibly effective mechanism that allows the government to grab a larger slice of your income without ever having to pass a law raising the headline tax rate.
And this brilliantly illustrates the direct conflict going on here. You have a rising nominal wage colliding with a static tax threshold. As inflation pushes your wages up, that unmoving tax threshold is quietly, automatically capturing more and more of your real income. The headline tax rate hasn't been touched at all, but that unmoving doorway, it's capturing more of your money anyway.
So just how effective is this invisible mechanism? Well, to put it in perspective, get a load of this number, 66.6 billion pounds. That is the staggeringly massive projected annual yield for the 2030 to 2031 financial year. And that's generated entirely by these frozen thresholds. We are talking about tens of billions of pounds flowing into the Treasury every single year, operating completely beneath the surface of all those standard political debates we usually have over tax rates.
If we track the data from the Office for Budget Responsibility, you can see exactly how rapidly this strategy has escalated into a primary revenue driver. Back in 2021, the government thought this whole thing would raise a relatively modest £8 billion. But then, inflation hit a massive peak of 11.1% in late 2022. That supercharged nominal wage growth. Suddenly, this modest little tool became an absolute juggernaut. We're seeing it jump from $27.2 billion in the 24-25 year to a projected $42.6 billion in 26-27, and riding all the way up to that mind-blowing $66.6 billion mark by the end of the decade.
Recognizing just how incredibly lucrative this mechanism is, the government made a very decisive policy choice in the 2025 budget. They committed to maintaining those static headline rates for income tax, national insurance, and VAT, basically keeping their core political promises. But simultaneously, they extended the freeze on personal tax and NIC thresholds for a further 3 years, stretching it all the way out until April 2031. This pretty much secures fiscal drag, not just as some temporary economic patch, but as a long-term, structural reality of the UK economy.
To truly grasp what that structural reality means, we really have to look at the human impact here. The sheer scale of this shift is wild. By 2030/31, this policy brings 5.2 million additional individuals, people who previously did not earn enough to be taxed at all, sweeping them right into the income tax system for the very first time. Meanwhile, 4.8 million taxpayers are dragged over the doorway into the 40% higher rate band, and another 600,000 are pushed into the 45% additional rate band. Literally millions of everyday workers are facing entirely new, much steeper tax realities.
But it's absolutely vital to know that fiscal drag doesn't stop at your personal paycheck. Let's talk about the secondary threshold. This is the static threshold at which businesses must start paying employer national insurance contributions. When salaries rise to match inflation, but this business threshold stays completely frozen, companies are suddenly hit with significantly higher tax bills just to keep their existing staff. And here's the thing. Businesses rarely just absorb those costs. They pass them on. Usually that happens through suppressed wage growth for their employees or by raising prices for consumers, creating this hidden ripple effect across the entire economy.
Okay, so we have clearly established the massive scale of this revenue collection. But that brings us to the next critical phase of our explainer. Where exactly is all this stealth revenue going? Why does the government need it so badly that they've essentially locked it in until 2031? Well, to answer that, we have to zoom out and look at the mounting, almost overwhelming pressures of public expenditure. Let's move to the 2026/27 financial forecasts and see how this builds. That massive £42.6 billion fiscal drag yield looks absolutely huge in isolation, doesn't it? But then you look at the competing pressures. Health and disability benefits alone sit at $89.5 billion, and total welfare spending completely dwarfs everything at an astronomical $351.9 billion. The reality is, despite extracting a record-breaking yield from taxpayers through bracket creep, it only covers about 12% of the escalating total welfare bill.
And hey, the pressure isn't just coming from welfare. Fully 10% of UK public spending is allocated purely to debt interest servicing. The UK is forecasted to spend a staggering £113.3 billion just to service past borrowing. To put that into perspective for a second, £1 in every 10 the government spends goes entirely toward paying interest on the national debt, not to actual public services, not to hospitals, not to infrastructure, just interest.
Let's connect that macro data back to the individual impact we were discussing earlier. Remember those 5.2 million ordinary workers brought into the tax system by fiscal drag? Well, 10% of every single new pound they contribute is instantly consumed by interest on past debt. There is a stark, measurable disconnect here between the brand new tax burdens ordinary people are shouldering and the actual delivery of public services they experience in their daily lives.
This disconnect creates what we can accurately call the middle-class squeeze. And importantly, this pressure goes far beyond the standard income tax bands we've already looked at. You see, the government uses static thresholds in other areas of the system too, quietly reducing support and increasing the overall burden on families.
A really perfect example of this is the High Income Child Benefit Charge, or HICBC. This mechanism operates identically to the fiscal drag we've been discussing. The threshold at which you start losing your child benefits is kept static, so as your nominal pay rises with inflation, you are increasingly stripped of those benefits. Your family's purchasing power might be completely flat, or honestly even declining, but your household disposable income suffers a direct, real terms hit because of that unmoving doorway.
When we step back and look at the overarching burden of this entire strategy, a very clear picture emerges. The Office for Budget Responsibility confirms that 3/4 of the revenue generated from maintaining these income tax and national insurance thresholds comes directly from the top half of UK households. The financial weight of patching the government spending gap is incredibly concentrated, and that concentration sets the stage for a very, very serious economic risk. We are now peeling back the final layer of the onion here, looking at a systemic threat, a fleeing tax base. When a government relies this heavily on a highly concentrated group of taxpayers to fund a massive deficit, using static thresholds and targeted wealth reforms, they expose themselves to the precarious risk of those exact taxpayers simply packing up and relocating. And according to the data, that risk is already materializing. Just look at this number, 16,500. Based on independent private sector analysis, that is the estimated net loss of millionaires migrating away from the UK in the year 2025 alone. Let's look exactly at what Henley & Partners reported for 2025. They project, quote, a net loss of 16,500 millionaires, representing $91.8 billion in wealth. The government has built a fiscal strategy that leans heavily on wealth and non-domiciled tax reforms to raise billions. But the thing about wealth is, it's uniquely mobile. When you lean too hard on this demographic through extended threshold freezes and new taxes, that wealth simply relocates, taking billions of dollars completely out of the domestic economy. So the crucial point here is exactly what the Office for Budget Responsibility is warning us about. Shrinking the long-term tax base isn't just about an immediate loss of tax receipts today. It creates a brutal domino effect. We risk losing high-net-worth individuals, sure, but also the entrepreneurs who start companies. We lose future business investment. We lose business ownership, infrastructure, and ultimately, we lose long-term employment opportunities for everyday workers. It's a vicious cycle that points straight toward long-term economic stagnation.
Which leaves us with one final, undeniable question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. If the wealth leaves, who fills the tax gap? The government has locked in escalating welfare costs and a massive national debt.
If the top earners migrate away to avoid the squeeze, the burden inevitably falls right back down the ladder onto everyone else. It's a fascinating and frankly sobering reality of how modern tax systems really operate. Definitely something to think about the next time you look at your payslip. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the numbers behind the headlines.